guys. All right.
Mr. Soul, let's go ahead and shut your camera off. Even though we like looking at you, we don't need to see. We don't. You can kill it.
Yeah, I'm doing that.
All right, so it looks like we're recording. We're good to go, guys. So I wanted to thank everybody for joining today and making the time to attend this meeting. We're going to be covering a template today called the order guide template. So those of you who are on the call, you probably already worked on other Birchstreet templates like the buyer and approval matrix templates that were sent out a few weeks back. So you've probably already been doing some of the work in terms of the Birchstreet implementation. This specific template is going to be mostly for the collection of item information so that you have a database of items already available in the system for you when you start using it. Now, there's no need to panic. There will already be some vendors in the system that have either a website integration or a catalog, a hosted catalog in the system. So I wanted to, before we actually get into the nitty-gritty of what needs to be provided on this template, I wanted to show you guys a demo of what those suppliers will look like in Birchstreet. Okay, so let me pull up Birchstreet over here. So if you guys can see my screen, this is what Birchstreet looks like. You're going to have all of your suppliers on the left-hand side here. And if you could do me a favor and just mute your line for the sake of the presentation, for the clarity and for the recording. And then if you do have any questions, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, if you can, I think we might be able to mute everybody.
Yeah, I'm looking for...
And then we will just try to do that.
Okay, I got it. Okay. All right. So like I mentioned, you'll have a list of suppliers here, and a few of them will have actually a website integration. So that first kind of supplier setup is called a punch-out supplier. So the reason that we call them punch-outs is because when you click on that supplier, it's actually going to redirect you into that supplier's website, and you'll be able to order like you normally would if you were accessing their website through the internet, like regularly. Okay, now when you punch out into their website, you'll go through, you'll order, and then you'll check out. And when you check out, it's going to bring a purchase order back into Birchstreet, and you'll be able to code that purchase order to the right department, the right cost center, and the right GL account. And then you'll be able to actually submit that through approvals, and it will be sent to the supplier after that. Okay? So like I mentioned, this is the first kind of supplier. It's called a punch-out supplier, and they are large enough to hold a website integration with our system. So for these suppliers, you really don't have to create any order guides for them because all of their items will be readily available for you within their website. Okay? All right. All right, so the second kind of supplier that we have is called an adopted or catalog supplier. Now, I have an example here. The reason that we call them adopted suppliers is because we've gone through and adopted them into our system. They host a catalog, and they actually have access to Birchstreet on their end, so they can modify things like item prices. They can change what items appear on the catalog, and they can add new items in. So they'll be hosting a catalog. All of their items will be readily available for you to use and to order from. Okay? So this is the second kind of supplier, again, a catalog supplier. All right? Now the third and last type of supplier that we have in Birchstreet is called a supplier on the fly. Your suppliers on the fly are mostly going to be your property-specific, your local vendors. Okay, so these are going to be your local mom and pop shops, local bakeries, etc. And when you try and click on one of them on the left-hand side here, so let's say I want to click on Dan's Paper Goods, you won't see a catalog for them. You won't see a website. These are actually vendors that will not have items already available in your database. Okay? So these suppliers on the fly are what we're going to want to worry about when we're filling out these order guides. Okay? So as you can see, when you click on that, Birchstreet's just going to pull up a page where you can fill out the item information from that vendor. Okay? Now there's a much quicker way to do this, and that's through the order guide template. All right, are there any questions so far on the 3 types of supplier setups that we have?
Nope.
No questions? All right. Okay, so in terms of the template, I just wanted to let you guys know it is extremely important that you read the instructions. So I did go through and create a specific set of instructions for you guys. There's a couple of pointers on here of things that need to be done on the template, and for example, like no columns can be removed. Anything in red is going to be a required column. So all of this is really important that you read through this just to make sure that you complete this correctly. Okay? And I've gone through and also specified additional information for every single column on the template in case you needed a clear explanation. Okay? So please do read the instructions on here before you go through and complete the template, because the last thing you want is to go through and fill out the template and then realize that you've done it wrong. Okay? But it isn't rocket science. It's not very complicated. Anything that's highlighted in red is a required field. So what does that mean? That means that if I don't fill out one of these columns, the order guide will be rejected when we try to import it. Okay, so it won't be able to be imported into the system. There aren't many required columns, but as you can see, there are other columns that don't show up in red, and these are going to be your optional columns. So mostly what these optional columns are for is for any additional information you might want to provide in terms of, in regards to that item. Okay? All right, so when you're filling out the template, all you have to do is go through column by column and see what's required. So the first thing we want to fill out is the SKU number, so the supplier's identifying number for that particular product. Okay? So a good place to find these SKU numbers is in old invoices. If you have those, you can find the SKU numbers on there. Now, if the supplier doesn't use a SKU number, what I would recommend is to make one up. Now, the key point here, the key important thing to remember is it has to be a unique number. Okay? The reason that this number has to be unique is because this is how the system is going to be updating prices for these types of vendors. It will identify that item through this SKU number. Okay? So let's say I'm filling out an item for Dan's paper goods, and Dan doesn't use SKU numbers, so I'm making up a unique SKU number for this particular product.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm watching it.
All right? So when there is a receiving process that needs to happen in Birchstreet, and when this item is received, let's say that the price on the invoice is slightly different. The receiver is able to update the price during the receiving process, and the system is going to look for this item number and update the price of that item in the system. Okay? So if this is not unique, it will mess up your item prices. So just a pointer for that, just make sure that all of your SKU numbers are unique. All right, so I've gone through and filled out my SKU number. The next thing that I need is the unit of measure. Now, I can't just go through and write in box in here, or write in the name or the description of how we're purchasing the item. There actually is a code that I have to insert in here. So if you noticed at the bottom of the spreadsheet, there's another tab called UOM codes. These are all of the existing units of measure that we have in the system. Now, you'll have a description on the right-hand side, but what you really want to look at is the stuff on the left. Okay? So if I'm buying this item by the bottle, then the code would be BTL. Okay? If I'm buying it by the box, the code would be BX. Okay? So let's go ahead and say that I'm buying a box of pens. Okay? The code is going to be BX, so I'm going to type in the code that I saw on the other tab. The price per box, this is the next column here that's required. Let's say it's $5 a box. Okay? And then the next thing that we need is a description of the item. Okay? So I'll go through. I would recommend in this field to be as specific as possible. Okay? So you want to make sure that the supplier gets you the correct item. So you want to include as much information as you can on here. So what I would say is maybe the type of pen, paper mate blue pens, box of 12. Okay. All right. Now we're done with all of our required fields here. All of the red columns have been filled out. So technically I could move on to the next item. However, let's go through some of these optional columns that we have on here, just so you guys are aware of what they'll do for you. So the next column that we have on here is sort order. This is useful for you if you want to be very specific about the order in which the items show up. So let's say that for some reason I have a list of 50 items, okay, on this particular order guide. If I wanted a particular item to show up as the first item on the list, I could assign this a value of 1 in the sort order field. And now when I import this list, that will be the very first item that shows up. Okay? Maybe if I want it to be the 5th item on the list, I would give it a 5. Okay? That's if you want to be really specific about the order. Otherwise, this is going to import, and it will show up in alphabetical order by the item description. Okay? All right, the next few fields that we have on here are for coding. So for your department and your GL account. Now, the reason that you might want to code a particular item to a specific department and or GL account is if you know that that item is always being purchased by the same department and will always be coded to the same GL account. Okay? You don't want to put this in if multiple departments are buying the item, and or it will be the GL account will differ depending on the purpose of the purchase. Okay, so if this is going to differ, then don't fill this out. If this will always be the same for that item, then you could fill it out and make it a little bit easier on you later on.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Are we only doing this for the first time for each vendor, and do we have to do a separate sheet for each vendor?
Excellent question. So this will be something that you'll always have. This functionality will always be available to you. The reason that we want to do this before you guys go live is so that we're better prepared. So, and we don't have to do it for every single vendor. It's just those vendors that won't have catalogs or websites in the system. So technically, you could import everything beforehand and get it over with. And yes, we do want one sheet per vendor.
And Brian, basically, you build this once and it's done forever. You never have to go back and do it again.
Unless you want to add it.
Unless you want to add an item and or delete. And yeah. And so you'll have your order guides, and they'll all be. If you code them with GLs in the beginning, you won't have to code any purchase orders when you create the orders.
Great, thank you.
Good question. We have another question from Melissa. She's actually using the chat feature on the WebEx, and her question is, how will we know what vendors are not already punch-out vendors? Excellent question. So I actually was going to cover this later on, but might as well. I have a list of core vendors for you guys that will be punch-out suppliers, so those that will have a website integration, and core vendors that will be cataloged. So what this is a list of suppliers that will apply to every single property, and you'll be able to see what kind of vendor they're going to be and what you're going to use. You're going to use this as a guideline. So anything that does not show up on this list, you might want to create an order guide for. Okay, now, I would focus on those vendors that you do a lot of business with, that you order a lot from, okay, and basically prioritize based on that. Okay. So I'll be sending this list out as well as the order guide template once we're done with this WebEx. Good question, Melissa. All right. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So moving on to the rest of these columns here. We have an items per case column if you want to specify how many units are in the case. A pack size, it's very similar to the items per case. And then a tax exempt column. So if this item is tax exempt, you would want to put in a 1 here. Okay, and this is just for reporting and informational purposes. If it's not tax exempt, then you'd want to leave it alone. And then the last column here is actually pretty important, and I would recommend that you fill this out even though it's not required. this is the commodity field. So what this means, it's just basically a category. And the reason that this is so important or so useful is that you can run reports in the system based on these commodities. So you could make up your own categories for your items for things that you want to see how much, let's say that you make up a category for baked goods. If you want to see how much you've been spending on baked goods on a monthly basis, you could run a report on that. Okay. So if you want to fill out this field, I would absolutely recommend that, even though you technically don't need to fill it out to import this template. Okay. All right. Any questions so far? All right.
So why don't you go back to Joanna, sorry. Can you go back to the vendor template and show us which vendors, and can you explain why the master distributors are not on that list?
Sure. So just so you guys know, even though you might not see some of your very large vendors on this list, like U.S. Foods or Cisco, etc., it's because they're regional. So there might be, for your property, there might be more punch-outs and more catalog vendors. But the reason that they don't show up on here is because they only apply to certain properties. This is only vendors that will apply to every single property. Okay? So depending on your region and your specific property, you may or may not have 1 or 2 more punch-outs and 1 or 2 more catalog vendors. Okay? All right. Okay, so a couple of things. Remember that you can only do 1 supplier per template. This is only a requirement for the import. In the system itself, these order guides can contain as many supplier items as you want. Okay? But for the initial upload, you're only allowed to put 1 supplier's items on the template, because when you import this, it's going to ask you to select which supplier to link these to. Okay? All right, so you'll go through and you'll fill out all these items. Think of this as like a catalog for this specific vendor. And once you're done, a couple of things. You'll notice that I've included a blue row right here. This blue row is sample information, a sample item in here so that you know how to fill out each column. You want to make sure that you delete this before you import it. The reason that you want to delete this is obviously you're not going to be buying pumpkin spice cupcakes. You don't want this to show up on your order guide. Okay? Yes, you guys will be importing this right before go live. We'll give you a user. You'll be able to log in beforehand and import these lists. Okay? And it's going to be good practice for you later on so that you know exactly how to import these in case you need to do it later. Now, when you go through and once you're done with this template, you're going to want to save it as a particular type of file. Okay? You're going to want to save this not as an Excel workbook. You want to save this as a CSV, delimited file. Okay? You absolutely must save it in this format for the system to be able to read it. You'll get an error message if you try to import any other format. Okay. All right. Any questions so far? Okay. I wanted to show you guys what this is going to look like. This is the last thing that I'm going to cover. What it will look like once you do import it. Okay, so you will have a screen here called the order guide screen. And in here, you're going to have every single order guide, every single list of items that you have imported or created manually. Because, yes, you can create this manually in the system. So let me go ahead and pull up my sample here. So it will show up basically like the Excel spreadsheet that you filled out. We'll have all the information on here, and all you will have to do when you start using the system is go through and type in how much you want to order of each item, and you'll be able to create your purchase order. Okay? So this is the reason that we're filling these out to begin with earlier, so that you'll already have these items available, and it'll make the ordering process a lot simpler for you. Okay?
Once this has been submitted, the first change, how do they go back for future purchase orders?
Excellent question. So you will be able to modify this. Once you import this, you'll be the owner. As you can see in here, it's in red, the person who imported or created the order guide. That's the owner of the order guide, which means that you'll be able to modify anything about this list. So if you want to change the name of the name of the product, the SKU number if you messed up on it, or the price if you messed up on that, you can modify that later on.
Okay, and so my follow-up based on your answer is what happens when we have turnover? I know that never happens, but what happens if it does?
So any administrators, so there will be some administrators at the corporate level of the system. So if the owner of the order guide leaves the property and they get deactivated, somebody will be able to go in and transfer the ownership of that order guide to somebody else. Or alternatively, if you don't want to have to go and ask an administrator for assistance with this, you can just copy all of the items and put them in a new order guide that you have created, and that will allow you to modify all that stuff. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Just so you guys know, I will be hosting another webinar in a couple of weeks once you guys have started working on these lists and you've made some progress on the data collection. I'll host another webinar to show you guys how to import this into the system. It's not very hard. It will be a click of a few buttons and you'll be ready. Okay.
I do have a question, Giovanni.
Sure.
When you're creating these order guides, I thought I understood that you could create an order guide that had multiple purveyors on it. Did you touch on that?
That's
I just wasn't paying attention.
Absolutely, yes. You can do that. The reason that I'm saying you only have to have one, you can only have one, is because for the import, actually, let me go through and actually show you guys what it looks like. When you're importing an order guide, let me see if I can find this here. It's going to ask you to select which supplier this is coming from. This is only for importing. If you're manually creating the order guide through the screen in the system, you can actually have multiple suppliers on here. Okay. And so it will ask you right here to select which supplier this is from. Okay. If you've already uploaded a few order guides and you want to combine some of the items in there, you can also do that by copying a few of these. You can copy the items and put them in a different order guide and mix and match. Okay.
So you could create, if you...
Go ahead.
If you have, let's say you have 4 purveyors and you buy like 3 bread products from one and 2 from somebody else, and then you buy 3 special products from another purveyor, you could actually create your miscellaneous food order guide.
Exactly.
Lovely.
And that's probably the best methodology for these lists, to have to do order guides by category or by product type. But the unfortunate part is when we're initially uploading this information, it does have to be just one supplier. But once you have it in there, it will be very easy to just mix and match and create a list for your miscellaneous items, for your office supplies, or for your light bulbs, etc.
Giovanna, another question. Do you plan to put out a how-to process mapping guide for everyone to use?
How to process for what exactly?
Various actions. How to create a list, how to upload, etc.
Well, I'm going to have another webinar to show you guys how to upload the order guides. Or would you prefer that I show you guys right now?
No. We need another one on that.
Don't worry, I was thinking of a document.
A document? I could put together a couple of screenshots. Sure. Let me write that down.
Yeah, because we're going to need to have something that we can pass off to all the staff here that, for futures, because if they have, pretty good instructions. So something in writing would be very helpful.
Okay. Well, in terms of the actual template itself, I did include instructions on here. also on how to fill this out. But when it comes to importing the order guide, I will create a document on that with screenshots and instructions on that.
Super.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Does this have something also to do with our invoicing and our invoices being paid in a timely manner? Because I'm understanding that, and maybe I'm talking to the wrong department or the wrong person, but I'm actually understanding that invoices are going to be held for 30 days, and we have vendors have to be paid in a timely manner, and if they're not, they will count. So am I talking to the part?
Why don't you give Rick Welpley or myself, Joseph Clam, a call after this conference, please? We can talk about that later on. Thank you.
That is an offline discussion.
All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys so much for your time today. Like I mentioned, I did record this, so I'll be sending out that recording to Yasmin, who will distribute it to you guys. All right. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Ivana.